One reason that many of us feel so socially exhausted in our relationships is because we do not have boundaries in place. Or if we do have boundaries in place, we don't actually enforce those boundaries or know how to go about enforcing those boundaries when they are crossed. So one thing that we are going to be doing today, and something that I like to do with my clients, is be able to identify what kind of boundaries they have. How do you protect yourself when your boundaries are crossed, and where do you feel on the boundaries list? Do you feel as though you're porous? Do you feel as though you have healthy boundaries? Do you feel as though you're rigid with your boundaries? So if we go through this, let's look at the first one in each category. So when we look at porous boundaries, it's when you let almost anyone get close to you. When we look at healthy boundaries, it's when you're selective about who you keep in and out. And then when we look at rigid boundaries, it's keeping most people at a distance. So someone who has rigid boundaries has an incredibly difficult time trusting in relationships, trusting in the world, and trusting in themselves. Someone who has porous boundaries, they overtrust. So if you think about it, it's still a matter of not knowing how to trust. How can you trust in a way that is not keeping everyone out and isolating everyone and not allowing you to have social relationships? But how can you also not trust in a way that's overly trusting and putting yourself in danger? So it's finding that middle ground and identifying when someone crosses those boundaries related to trust. Right? So that's one of the first things that you want to do when identifying your boundaries. Look at the deeper reasoning to why you have that boundary put in place. Maybe you have a difficult time trusting because your parents weren't consistent caregivers, right? So actually making those connections, and maybe you have a difficult time enforcing that boundary. Well, because maybe when you spoke up for yourself as a child, you were often shunned and put down for speaking up for yourself. So it's understanding where these boundaries come from, why certain boundaries may actually be linked to a trigger or to certain traumas, and how do you actually enforce those boundaries.